talking about Iran, and Israel has been making a lot of threats. So I don't know which one you want to start on first, but go ahead and let's just get into the threats that Israel has been making and the American officials they're meeting with.
Absolutely. So last week we had Naftali Bennett, the new the new prime minister of Israel, who replaced Netanyahu, come to D.C. for his first visit to D.C. And so he met with Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, Lloyd Austin, Pentagon chief, and then Joe Biden. He was supposed to meet with Joe Biden last Thursday, but of course, the Afghanistan, the excuse me, the meeting was moved because of everything going on in Afghanistan with the attack outside Kabul airport. So now, actually, we've seen some of the reporting coming out about what's been going on. And since you mentioned the threats, I'll just say that in advance of the meetings, Bennett was speaking to the New York Times, and he was saying essentially that he was going to present Biden with a new strategy for how to deal with Iran that would not include a U.S. return to the Iran deal, to the JCPOA. And he talked about how he would step up and continue the covert attacks inside Iran, including what he called the gray area stuff. And he also said that, among other things, that they would build up alliances with the Gulf states to essentially to counter, as they put it, Iranian aggression. But this is really more about aggression against Iran. And also, we saw that he was already basically saying that, even ahead of the meeting, because we know that the Biden administration has expressed some displeasure about the continuing settlement expansion in the West Bank, and what's been going on in Palestine. They said they're not going to make any peace deals with the Palestinians. They're not entertaining that, and they're going to continue the settlements. So, getting into the actual meetings. Austin met with Bennett. Oh yeah, so we'll get to the so Austin met with Bennett, and he said Austin came out and said he was personally committed to deepening their security relationship with Israel. He said that commitment is steadfast and ironclad. He reaffirmed the U.S. policy supporting Israel's qualitative military edge, their ability to unequivocally dominate any states in the region. He explicitly said that the reason they're doing this is because of the threat from Iran, as well as their proxies and their terrorist groups. He said,
Connor,
Iran.
can I just add a little bit there, because I think this is really important, because the Biden administration has agreed to move forward with that $20+ billion weapon sale to the UAE that I believe includes Predator drones and F-35s and all of that. And the quantitative military edge program calls for them to have superior weaponry, not only to, Iran or whoever the enemy in the Middle East is, but any state in the Middle East. And so Israel has already, during the Trump administration, they were using that weapon sale to try to get more advanced U.S. weapons. And interesting that the Biden administration is moving forward with the same exact Trump policy now, even though there was a month or two where it was ambiguous, because they did freeze that agreement once they took over, but then they ended up unfreezing it.
No, absolutely. In fact, yeah, no. So, but when Biden came in, of course, he's continued the genocide in Yemen, but he was making all kinds of promises he didn't follow through about how I'm going to, what did he say? Stop all relevant arms sales. Yeah, offensive military operations, and was it relevant arms sales to those And so they froze that sale to the UAE for a minute, like you said, and then they let it go through. And the fact is, I remember Ted Snyder, I think, writing about this last year. I think I cited him in a nice block quote in one of my pieces from last year about Iran, where he was talking about how they were supporting the sales to the UAE, and then saying, well, you got to give us these bunker buster bombs, to keep up the QME. But as he pointed out, this was, after the attacks on Natanz in the summer, because there was this extensive sabotage campaign against Iran, all kinds of infrastructure. Some of it, was Israel, it's ambiguous on other things, but attacks on like hospitals and ports and things like that. But they did attack the Natanz facility, to the point where the Iranians had to make significant renovations to it and build, they had to essentially, I think, move some of the facility even further underground. And so the Israelis were lobbying the U.S. for these. And I think even Congress was supporting this, which sounds about right. But essentially, they were looking for these bunker buster bombs so that they could attack the Natanz facility if they chose to. So Austin is saying that's he's reaffirming the support for that's an American policy, the QME, the qualitative military edge for Israel, with all of our military aid. It's nearly $4 billion a year. He says Iran must be held accountable for aggression in the Middle East and on international waters. Referencing, we covered, I think 2 shows ago, on those incidents in the ships, including the Mercer Street tanker, an Israeli-linked tanker near Oman, where I believe it was a Romanian and a British national who were killed. Iran has been accused of this by the British, the Americans, the Israelis most notably. And they were, the Israelis were calling for actually to attack. They were saying we may just attack them ourselves, but essentially they wanted some sort of international coalition to attack Iran. But of course, the Iranians, I think is, I'm blanking on their foreign ministry spokesman's name, but he was great throughout that whole incident, because he kept coming out and saying, look, if you have evidence, why don't you present it? And they never really did. In fact, Dave DeCamp covered on this show a few episodes ago just how questionable the evidence that CENTCOM produced was. They showed a picture of something that looked like a suicide drone, and then they go, it's basically busted to hell, and there was hardly anything left, and they go, well, the fin of this resembles something we've seen put out by Iran before, and so therefore it must be Iran. And it was, extremely, they didn't really prove anything.
They found 2 similar 90-degree pieces of bent metal and claimed that was proof of the attack. Something, just to take a quick detour and talk about this, the Mercer Street incident, something we were just talking about before the show, Connor, is this is such a great example of how the war state launders their news to create their narrative, where, they reported on this in somewhat in the mainstream up until the point where the U.S. would actually have to present evidence and have an actual debate. Did Iran actually do this or not? This is what we have for evidence. This is their counter arguments. And right when that happens, suddenly it's lost in the news cycle and nobody talks about it. And so now when you brought this up to me, you say, Lloyd Austin will say that the Mercer Street happened and that's why we had to be aggressive against Iran. Everybody just has to go along with it and kind of nods their heads, because the last time they heard about the Mercer Street, everybody was pointing the finger at Iran, and nobody covered it since to say that Iran didn't do it. So, I'm sure General Austin's right.
Yeah, exactly. And we see this a lot with, the accusations and I think an advisor to Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister of Russia, brought this up recently. It's nothing really particularly new, but I always thought it was notable that this guy just came out and said it, that essentially the U.S. is waging a new psychological war, sort of a mind war, by throwing out all these myriad unproven allegations, and then just kind of, in a sort of a Goebbels-esque way, you just keep repeating a big lie again and again and again. You don't have to prove, as far as I'm concerned, if you don't prove it, it's a lie. Especially on this, on the international stage, you're accusing another state of attacking and killing people, and then using that to justify. Well, if we were not returning to the Iran deal and they were making all kinds of threats, we're going to get to that more. The Iranians are saying, Biden illegally threatened Iran in this meeting with Naftali Bennett. But essentially we're killing people with our sanctions. So, it's justified on the whole point of, the whole sanctions regime on Iran is based on the idea that they're racing toward a bomb, which is something we always hear, but we're even hearing now more and more as the Israelis especially attempt to thwart any return to the JCPOA. And that is just simply not true, and it's never been true. But the statistics, Daniel Larison wrote a piece a little while ago about some statistics that came out that showed that You know what? I'm going to blank on the exact
It's a
numbers.
majority of Americans that believe Iran has a nuclear weapon, and there's nowhere near a majority that think that Israel does. And of course, Israel has the nuke and Iran doesn't. Connor, but let's move back to this, and he keeps talking about these threats. So at I guess the meeting between Biden and Bennett, I was almost surprised that it wasn't a news story at all, that meeting got bumped. I just felt like Bennett would have been a little ticked about it, but I guess maybe it was a big enough story, and nobody really covered the fact that it got bumped. It just kind of like happened, and so I guess there wasn't really a PR issue with it. And if anybody remembers that meeting at all, I think, Connor, other than me, you, and the people who comment on foreign policy, it's that 20-second clip where it looks like Biden dozes off, which I mean, in a way, I kind of want to make a big deal out of, because I think it's great to undermine the U.S.-Israel relationship, and this would be a way. Look, and if Biden did that to Bennett, Israel, when the U.S. was trying to restart talks with Iran, they were doing all these covert measures, and they hit the Iranian ship in the Red Sea and stuff like that, like 2 days after the U.S. said they were going to engage in direct talks with Iran. So maybe Biden did it on purpose. I mean, that would be a pretty, it's a grandpa move, but it's a pretty, awesome grandpa move to doze off intentionally when you're having a very public meeting with somebody. But go ahead and tell us the actual important details of this meeting.
Sure. And I'll just add my reaction to that when I first saw it was like, Biden has been known for decades as Israel's man in Washington, and this is so formulaic, the things that he said. Really, this was part of a PR campaign. If you read like Phil Weiss and Mondo Weiss, they're trying to, a big aspect of this was because there were no concessions made over on the Palestinian issue. So to try and because Democrats are becoming increasingly, especially post-Trump, Trump kind of made the Israel issue almost a more of a partisan issue than it had been in the past. So it made it more difficult especially in the wake of Black Lives Matter and all the attacks on Gaza, especially like even last May. We're seeing more and more. We're going to talk about that, statistics of people wanting to condition aid to Israel and all kinds of things, especially Democrats. And so a big part of this, you'll keep hearing things like they'll say, Naftali Bennett keeps coming out and going, oh, Biden and I were really good friends, close friends, very close friends. I feel like I've known him forever. That was just a great meeting, and we just hit it off. And they're trying to sell this idea that but Joe likes him, so don't you, Democrats? Come on, get with the program. So it was so funny because he could do that, those talking points himself. So it probably did put him to sleep. But so Biden said while he was talking to Bennett, he goes, the threat, he's speaking to reporters in the Oval Office, and he says, the threat from Iran and our commitment to ensure, he said that we discussed the threat from Iran and our commitment to ensure Iran never develops a nuclear weapon. And this is for people who want to check it, Middle East Eye. Biden tells Israel's Bennett there are other options if nuclear talks fail. And he says, we're putting diplomacy first. We'll see where that takes us. But if diplomacy fails, we're ready to turn to other options. He said, without offering specifics. And then Bennett said, I was happy to hear your clear words that Iran will never be able to acquire a nuclear weapon, and that you emphasize that you will try the diplomatic route, but there's other options if it doesn't work out. And so Bennett has promised, they mentioned that any objections he has to the nuclear deal will be discussed privately with the White House in a bid to repair strained ties with the Democratic Party. Like I was leading to earlier, maintain a more bipartisan position with its closest ally. But it's so ironic because, look at all this coverage. It's not exactly quiet what they're doing. So other notes from the meeting. Let's see. Biden said. So there's that report from Axios as well about the death by 1,000 cuts Iran strategy, where they say that these are Israeli officials speaking to Axios, and they say that they're giving you some of it seems like they're trying to sort of box the Americans in to some extent, because they're just anonymous Israeli officials. But I thought this was a notable report, and they say. But at the same time, it gets us a little bit of insight into what was going on behind, in the actual meeting itself. And they say. The main goal was lobbying the U.S. not to return to the JCPOA. Bennett came to express urgency about how close Iran is getting to the bomb. The Israelis, Bennett presents let's see. He wants the strategy to be, as they characterize it, small actions across a number of fronts, military and diplomatic, instead of a single dramatic strike. And let's see. He framed the situation. This is ridiculous. As uh, it's kind of like your Cold War with the Soviet Union. Iran is the Soviet Union of the region, and America, of course, Israel is, of course, the America of the Middle East. And he goes, uh, it's ironic that he said that, because actually the whole anti-Iran push, because they were allies for decades and maintained a covert relationship, through the Iran-Iraq War and into the early 90s. It wasn't until the actual end of the Cold War, as Scott Horton explains in Enough Already, that they switched sides essentially because they had to find, as Trita Parsi talks about in Treacherous Alliance, he quotes, I forget exactly what official or who he quotes, but the line I always remember is they needed new glue for the alliance. Now that Saddam had been smashed and that the communist Soviet Union no longer existed, how do we justify all this aid and this special relationship? So they settled on this PR campaign against radical Islam, really focusing on Iran, and they used Martin Indyk in the Clinton administration, and that's the whole dual containment strategy of Iran and Iraq that largely led to 9/11 as far as what motivated the Al Qaeda attacks. And so he lobbied the U.S. also to stay in Syria and Iraq, which I thought was very interesting. And they said that we want to put Iran's aggression back in a box, regional aggression as well as its nuclear program. I think they said back in the box. And a big part of that, of course, is they want the Americans, presumably indefinitely, to stay in Syria and Iraq. And the Israeli officials who are talking to Axios, they say they're very optimistic after post the meeting, as far as they're, they think Biden is very they think Biden will go along with that, basically, which is, totally lines up with all the reporting we've been seeing about the policy. Really nominal changes on Iraq. It's no longer combat, it's an advisory mission. Are you withdrawing any troops? No. And Syria, even though he doesn't seem to know we have troops there, or maybe he does, maybe he doesn't, but we certainly have, it's very clear that we are not leaving Syria. We're going to continue to occupy the country.